All right, thank you.
So what? Why don't you guys do this? Do each do like a 30-second intro on who you are, your contacts and such, and then you can jump into your 3 minute monologues, and then do a 3 minute round.
Well, you can include that if you like into your 3 minute opener.
All right. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm Caskie. I'm a fucking no one. I have 4 subscribers. Um, yeah, I'm just a left-leaning dude, probably like a libertarian, democratic, socialist, something like that. Anyway, so my as for my opening statement today, I do have a little bit of something prepared.
Oh, nice.
So, there were just notes that I was taking from our last sort of comment thing that we were talking about. Anyway, so basically, my belief is that capitalism is an unhealthy, immoral, and non optimal system. We should be striving for a system which maximizes both human freedom and well being. Capitalism does not promote either of these things in comparison to socialism, because the benefits, health insurance, etc., a worker might get under a certain employer under capitalism require that the worker stay subject to whatever conditions are thrust upon him by that employer. So that minimizes human freedom. Um, Further, the inherent employer employee relationship does not promote well being or a fair distribution of wealth. There are just certain antagonisms that uh, basically ensure that the worker does not get his fair due under capitalism. Um, we don't necessarily live in a system that's geared towards optimizing either of these things, because workplace safety, worker pay, being fair, etc., are things that have never really existed under capitalism. We have to fight for these things. If capitalism were an optimal system, these things would exist inherently, but of course they don't. Um, we can see that in comparison, libertarian forms of socialism in the Zapatista communities in southern Mexico do pretty well to alleviate the serious inequalities faced by indigenous peoples in impoverished southern Mexico. So they have a lot better healthcare, a lot better education systems, and what have you. Um, so that's about it. That's all I really want to say.
Okay, excellent, excellent. We have your opening statement. Um, I'm going to now inject my opening statement. So, I'm coming from the position that that essentially supports our modern version of capitalism, today's version of capitalism. To my knowledge, and the best of history, with some degree of understanding of the ideas, marketplaces, and things like that, I believe a well-regulated free market and system is simply just the best for stability and longevity and success for any republic. Now, our nation has the benefit of using all the best parts of things like socialism without employing them full scale. Um, we're not really that ashamed to admit it as a nation here in the United States. Our military ranking system, officer and enlisted ranking system, is actually an adopted system from the British. And the reason we adopted it is because it's effective. It's one of the most effective ways of us to effectively move and communicate and get the mission done with the military. So we've adopted a system that almost mirrors their system. And we also adopt other mechanisms. For our country, we are a constitutional republic with democratic and socialist mechanisms. We have democratic election processes and socialist mechanisms such as welfare, Medicaid, unemployment, police, fire, ambulatory, and our military. So, our military for us has been a great engine for less enfranchised families to lift themselves out of poverty. But I wouldn't want to spend the entire time talking about which side is responsible for which atrocities. I would rather talk about which side is responsible for lifting the largest majority of people out of poverty since then, since essentially since their implication. Um, so that's basically it in terms of speaking for the side of capitalism. I believe with the things that have been shown and the with the results, lifting nearly 80 million people out of poverty, um, as opposed to any atrocities, that would be the best, most successful system for us, for as nations to use and communicate with other nations. And that is the position that I'm coming from now. So if we can move into the next portion of it, would be sort of the back and forth, the Q&A question for ourselves. Would you like to interject, or do you have any questions?
Yeah, I just have a quick statement.
Yeah, sure.
I we sort of talked about this, and so it'll probably just come up anyway.
Okay.
But first of all, I just want to bring up that lifting people out of poverty thing.
Hmm.
Um, the metric by which extreme poverty is determined is if someone is living on something less than $1.90 a day.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I again, I just still don't think that's a proper metric to determine whether someone is living comfortably, or
Hmm. Well,
um,
we could say this. We could take a look at our local scale in the United States, or we could look at the global scale. And if we do, in fact, look at the global scale, all Americans, even our poorest Americans, are still in the 1% of the global scale. So, in terms of poverty, we really have to look at that exact scale that actually you were just mentioning, because we have Americans, our poorest Americans are essentially rich people in other countries.
yeah, but capitalism exists globally. So if we want to talk about the mechanisms of capitalism, of modern capitalism, being something that lifts people out of poverty, wouldn't we want to do so globally, considering that it exists pretty much globally? Why would we just look at America?
Well, it does exist globally. Absolutely, it does exist globally, but of course, it's practiced globally, but not practiced internally. And many of these countries that we're talking about, like Laos, Vietnam, China, I mean, these are countries that are still very heavily communist. However, state policy isn't dictated as much by the communism aspect of it as is basically trade agreements. We take a look at Hong Kong, for example, as a completely separate entity from Beijing, even though it's obviously the same nation. It's Hong Kong is China. We basically have a highly developed free market society in Hong Kong, and many of the recent protests were taking place in Hong Kong because they want to maintain those freedoms. They want to be able to maintain those abilities to open jobs and open up businesses for themselves. Whereas in the rest of China, they actually have a social currency. Some people are so low on the social currency that they cannot purchase plane tickets or train tickets. They can't leave the towns that they're in. It's sort of the untouchables of their society. So I'm not saying that that's a direct result of it. I know that that's something that's permissible under communism.
Well, I mean, okay, so if we want to talk about communism, I'm sure this also came up and will again also come up. But for example, Vietnam and China are not um, communist countries. They're countries that have a communist party in power, but the economy, the actual political economic mechanisms that are in place in those countries are state capitalist or capitalist.
Right, that's correct, which is why I actually iterated that the Communist Party don't dictate the state economic policy, essentially because they have to participate on the world stage with the rest of us. They have to be able to buy and sell goods. They have to be able to do this with other countries because this is what brings their wealth in. If they were a strictly communist or socialist country, that had anarcho-fascism or socialism instituted, they wouldn't be able to trade or make money with the rest of the world.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, I just had to fix my notes.
No problem. No
Um,
problem. No problem.
so
So we were
yeah,
talking. So we
I
were talking about communism governing state economic policy in communist countries, and how it doesn't really have that much dictation on it because you can't play on the world stage if you're not playing the game with the same game with everyone else. You essentially can't make any money.
yeah, so because trade with more liberal economies, for example, with just capitalism in general, don't you think that that would have a certain weight on whether or not, like, I because I'm sure this is also going to come up, why countries that were formerly socialists might not do well alone, and why that might not necessarily be indicative of the system's failure, but rather just the
Well,
the
a perfect
conditions that
example, I
that
think, of what you're talking about here would be like Romanian socialism, which would be one of the reasons why Romanian socialism wasn't squarely on the reason of socialism. However, they could not interact with other countries on the same social stage that everyone else could, on top of other corruption and governmental failings that completely ruined it. You had um, mass poverty, mass homelessness, mass starvation, and this was as a result of economic policies from socialism, but not 100% due to it. But this could definitely be attributed to the downfall of Romanian socialism.
Okay, well, now while I know basically nothing about socialism in Romania,
Okay.
I do want to say that there are serious conditions like those international conditions that might cause Romania as a socialist country to fail,
Hmm.
whereas we could do something much better in the United States.
Would you mean say like an embargo that would hurt them further? Like let's say what happened with Cuba.
Yeah, definitely embargoes. For example, Cuba, Venezuela, all of these places have been subject to massive amounts of embargoes and um, what's the word? Uh, oh well,
Tariffs
just
and
yeah,
basically,
well,
well, the embargo, not really tariffs. You have to have trade in order to have tariffs, but the embargoes were basically well, Cuba and their alignment to Russia and the missile crisis did play a massive factor into that. But
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
because they were within spitting distance of our shores, and they allowed Russia to put up massive missile silos there. So that's not something that the United States can necessarily think that that's a good thing to do. I would agree that the embargo went on too long, but we can take hard looks at the numbers and what socialism of itself sort of degenerated pieces of that country.
Um, Again, I don't know much about socialism in Cuba, but to be fair, and to clarify, I am more of a democratic socialist, and I don't agree with anything like the USSR or what have you.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I'm very much against authoritarianism and all
Well,
sorts of
that's
things like that.
that's great to hear because I'm against that as well. And we can go ahead and fast forward to social democracy. If I could just steel man your position on this, and you tell me if I'm wrong. Using the
Okay.
you understand IDW steel manning, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so for democratic socialism, the basic definition is a political philosophy supporting political democracy within a socially owned economy, with a particular emphasis on workers. Basically, self-management and democratic control of the economic institutions within a market, social economy, or some form of decentralized planning, socialist economy. Is this essentially what that portion of that is? I mean, we're not talking about the fascism. Excuse me. The basically anarcho dictatorships. The dictatorships rather of the previous versions of communism and socialism. You're talking strictly from the democratic socialism aspect on the economic side, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Just basically with an emphasis on worker co-ops, what have you, and yeah, I like
So you don't
democracy.
advocate for syndicalism.
Uh, in what way?
Well,
When
syndicalism
worker?
is basically the same version of it, only it's an earlier version of it. Syndicalism has almost the same definition, only it was instituted originally in 1840. Around 1847 to 1922 was the big rise and fall of syndicalism, and it had a big impact on French labor unions at the turn of the century. And French labor unions would pit against their owners for wages and things like that. And this created a giant movement of transferring ownership of the control of means of production and distribution to the workers. So this is essentially in my idea. This is not the same exact thing. However, its roots are deeply, deeply embedded in early syndicalism. From what I've my research from on democratic socialism.
Okay, so to clarify, then I think that syndicalism, I guess, in the terms of the idea being that the trade unions should be the main political body, I think that that's necessary to bring about democratic socialism.
So
Um,
advocating democracy in the work, like a democratized workplace.
I'm all about workplace. 110%.
Okay. I think my only question from there is where, in what sense do you feel like the workplace can and should be democratized? Like, why? What would be the reason of the real reason for quote unquote democratizing the workplace? Because it sounds good on the one end, of from where you're coming from in terms of, oh well, we'd like to make these things more votable. What is the benefit of that? I mean,
Well,
where can we see the benefit of that?
um, in general, everywhere. Because first of all, workers are alienated from their labor. They don't get to choose what they do. They don't have any sort of level of self management. Um, Basically, you're against authoritarianism. So I would hope that you would agree, uh, the structure as it stands, a general firm with one boss just dictating all of the decisions, that sort of sounds like a dictatorship, doesn't it? That's pretty authoritarian. I think that, as someone that likes freedom, that likes democracy, we should try to expand freedom and democracy as much as we can in people's daily lives.
Hmm.
Why the fuck should democracy just be something where we vote every 2 years?
Right.
Why can't we just have democracy in the big part of our daily lives, which is where we work?
Hmm.
I think that's a major benefit, just people having more democratic freedom in their basic existence. And
So if you don't mind me asking, do you think that, like, let's say that this was somehow instituted in the next 3 to 5 days in all businesses, where do you think that would give the average worker more or less control over the say in their work environment?
well, isn't that definitionally true?
Not
Because
necessarily, because if you think about it, now I'm just using this as an example. You may you may participate in local elections for your senators and your congressmen, but there is no, like, you don't necessarily have any more or less direct control over your living environment or your political environment just because you voted.
but isn't having the freedom to vote on workplace decisions or electing your managers or what have you, what doesn't that just by itself
Now,
indicate more freedom,
now
like in
this
the
is the
immediate?
this is the major crux of, I think, the argument slash disagreement between us. Now, I thoroughly believe in freedom of choice, right? So I advocate the freedom of choice to the highest extent, but with certain things we have to take into consideration the realization of actual competency. How many people are truly competent to be able to do these types of jobs, to pull off these jobs? It would seem that, oh, that one guy who sits at the top of whatever company making 50 times the average worker obviously doesn't do 50 times the amount of labor. But
Sure.
competency in management is one of the most difficult things any business anywhere could ever find. And my reasoning for this goes back to our roots early as Americans, but also as people. The oldest records we have as people are tax and property records and military records. Our military and all militaries are the first and foremost frontiersmen in terms of determining someone's competency and intelligence. In order to have competent military officers and leaders, you have to be able to accurately gauge competence. So when the military first started doing this, this is something that transformed into the rest of our essential societies. If you think about what the workplace essentially is, everybody wears a suit, everybody sort of looks the same. It's almost built like in a military fashion. You have a head of a corporation and a rank structure and a hierarchy. Now, uh, the thing with these positions is these positions are not something that are simply just given to people. Although I can see the corruption side of it. Of course, there's corruption. Of course, there's corruption. My problem is that if we were to hand over this directly into the government's hands and have them dictate this, that would not be a good outcome for anyone. They would not necessarily operate in any other means than the free market, any better means than the free market could. And for example, the free market provides solutions for things that that essentially a socialist market wouldn't be able to provide.
Oh,
Going to the free market has solved a lot of problems for the United States and for other countries.
Okay, to clarify, I did mention earlier worker co-ops. I don't
Yes.
want the state to necessarily be controlling all these businesses. And I know where you're sort of going with bringing up the military, and you said the sort of
Competency and
competency.
intelligence.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that under a certain threshold in the comments um, that people were not fit for any job,
Oh, and no, it's
but
not they're not fit. It's just that any job that they would perform would be counterintuitive to the mission. So they would not be able to perform uh, a job in the military that would not be
yeah,
counterintuitive. But however, if the civilian market has provided uh, gainful employment for around 7%, 7 of the 10% of people who have an IQ under 83, which is that threshold that you were speaking of. So the fact that the free market solution has brought up a solution to put a little more than 21 million people to work who are effectively unemployable is a miracle of modern. It's a complete miracle.
oh, okay, but again, we were talking about military jobs, so things that are that are counterintuitive to the success of the mission, right?
Yes.
So, but that's a military and not a civilian marketplace or a workplace. If those people are employed currently, why would they not be employed under socialism? Like, what would be keeping them from doing the same job?
Because it would fall to the populist vote. It would fall to the vote of the
Wait,
essentially under that idea for efficiency, a majority vote of a company wouldn't essentially just make those calls. I mean I've never seen an instance of worker co-ops retaining 10% of employees that are, let's say, people who are fall into that 83% category. Now this is possible that there is a worker co-op. However, the thing about worker co-ops, and again, what segueing back to what I was talking about, my love of freedom of choice, is worker co-ops that we have today are voluntary. So they're not mandated by the state or by law. So people can voluntarily enter a worker co-op and voluntarily leave. Under the system that's being proposed this way, you could not voluntarily do that. All businesses would have to be under this very same sort of framework. So that doesn't
wait,
leave the freedom of
but but
option.
it's a better framework than what we have. So if they have a disagreement with people in one worker co-op or something, why wouldn't they just leave and go to a different one?
You see,
They have that
that's
freedom.
where
We
we
live in
start
a
weeding.
democracy.
That's where we start weeding through the details. If you put in X amount of time, because this is worker owned means of production, yes, or is this only just democratized of the workplace? Because if the
Um,
workers essentially are owning the means of production by casting these votes, they're the ones that are going to vote on everything. They're going to vote on their budget. They're going to vote on the pay. They're going to vote on who gets to work. They're going to vote on everything, right?
sure.
Okay, so if they look at a margin and say, well, this is going to save us 10% and we're going to be able to pay our larger, most competent workforce a higher wage, what's to stop them from making that decision in the same way that a privatized company would?
I don't see anything wrong with people voting to give certain, you know,
Oh no,
more
I
efficient
don't see
workers or any.
anything wrong with people voting. Like we have that sort of institution even in private companies. Even people in private companies are asked, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And though that information goes up higher. And like you said with worker co-ops, I firmly believe in worker co-ops. I think they're a great augmentation to an already working system. The thing is worker co-ops are not mandated by the law. They are most certainly all voluntary, and that's essentially why we have things like LLCs. Those limited liability corporations allow a couple of guys to get together to form a company in their garage and bring forth their ideas. Now, one more thing I wanted to interject on this in terms of intelligence. 80% of new businesses fail within the first 5 years. I think it's 30% in the first year, and that number skyrockets to 80% in the first 5 years. Do you have a knowing or understanding or reason as to why that happens to new businesses?
There could be any number of reasons.
I can tell you what
I don't
the biggest number is. The biggest reason.
hit me.
The biggest reason has to do with competency. A lot of people undertake these grandiose things that they're not competent enough to. The secondary thing to that, they're not competent enough to maintain, but the secondary is the funding. The funding runs out. Their planning isn't good enough to last them through the first 5 years. Any business that makes it through the first 5 years is usually going to thrive because they're now a recognized name brand. They're usually growing into new branches, and if they have a good product that they're offering to the public, who has to come in and buy that product, then certainly that's a good augmentation to our society as a whole. So
Do you think that there's any significant differences in management that might cause, a regular firm with one employer and I guess a couple employees if he has them, or just a one man startup? Do you think there are any conditions, just by nature of one person making decisions himself that might cause businesses like that to fail
oh,
80% of the
absolutely,
time,
absolutely,
as
and
as opposed
absolutely.
to a system where a workplace is democratized and people collectively make decisions and are able to debate and talk about why something is just fucking dumb?
Well, no, you're 100% correct. And on that, there's absolutely. And the biggest thing is when you have a CEO who hands a company off to their son, who is wholly incompetent and cannot run the company. And they'll do that for generation after generation until the company rides itself into the ground. The most
Sure.
successful companies, are ones that are run by boards. And those boards are the ones who make decisions. However, there's a difference between a board of directors and an entire workforce voting on how to spend the yearly budget. Because it would become an endless string of meetings for people, for hundreds of workers who work the most menial of jobs. I mean, I don't mean to bounce around, but look at a factory worker. His entire job is to press a button on an assembly line which stamps out a piece of metal, and then they move the piece of metal and they do it again over and over again. They'll do that a few thousand times, and then that's it. That's the end of the job. It's that repetitive job. There's a few
Yeah.
reasons why that person is working in that job and why that person is not working upstairs on the fifth floor in a big office. The reason being is the services that person is providing is relative to what they're doing. Again, like I circling all the way back to the 83 IQ level being the threshold of competence in the United States military. Yes, you said that was a military job. That's true, but workplace accidents, people who don't have the competence to run a simple machine by pressing a button on it, or people who do things that are relatively stupid, which I'm sure you and I both know swaths of people like that. These are the people who cut their fingers off, and these are the people who get in workplace accidents and things like that. These very same people are operating this heavy, heavy machinery, and all they have to do is press a button, move a piece of steel, press a button, move a piece of steel, and they can't, like in some instances, they can't even get that right. So putting the direction of the company in the hands of these people, it's not necessarily a good thing, only because worker co-ops are made of the most incompetent people of that company. If you get 10 carpenters together to make a worker co-op to create a carpenter company, these are the 10 best carpenters of their group. Um, and this sort of cascades into the argument about hierarchies and inequality, which we can certainly have that argument. I'd like to have that argument with you if you can about inequality of outcome, but that's
Sure.
essentially my position there.
Well, just I think that certainly if uh, all decisions were made by everyone, that might get a bit tedious. So I do understand that maybe there should be a certain level where managers or people elected to make decisions,
Uh huh.
sort of within that company, then go on to do it. At least then it's less authoritarian or less unjust as a hierarchy, because at least those people are chosen to make decisions
That's
for the
true.
rest of the
That's true.
company.
Bringing it back to the military, we take a look at the military rank and structure order. We have lieutenants and captains, and these are the officers. These are the people who lead the enlisted. Now, the enlisted are people who are like privates, sergeants, staff sergeants, gunnery sergeants, master sergeants. These are the enlisted folks. Now, these are the people who you don't need a college degree. All you got to do is just graduate high school, and you can join the military. And the military has been a good segue for people to lift themselves out of an impoverished or a very low status into a higher status, into essentially white collar, with paid training, with all the things that we need in the military. However, officers are dictated on their intelligence. You have to have a degree. You have to go to 6 months of training. Their training is far more intelligence, academically rigorous, as opposed to the training that your average Marine or Army or sailor, Army or Navy personnel might undertake, because their training is essentially boot camp, learning how to march, learning how to tie your boots. Whereas officer training is they're learning how to call in airstrikes. They're learning how to give nine line reports, and they have to have the competence to be able to pull those things off in extreme stressful situations, wartime stressful situations. It's not to say that there are dumb people in the world, but there are dumb people in the world. I've met my fair share of them, and that number is shockingly larger than most people would like to admit. We all want to believe that we're all the same, but the truth is we're not. We have an intelligence in some of us that is far superior, and then other people who can barely tie their shoes or make a hot pocket. These are the types of people that we essentially have to be able to give them a gainful life and figure out a way for them to have a gainful life in this world. But by no means could we give this person the ability to make those kinds of decisions at the upper echelon, because they're not going to be voting in the best interest of their competency and intelligence.
Well, my opinion is that they can still, a under 83. I don't even know how, if that's that low. If the military thinks that's, not beneficial to the mission, then again, I
Oh no,
want
that's
to
that's a
suggest that
person that's a person who could barely tie their shoes. That's a person who couldn't put their uniform on right. That's a person who can't fire a
I'm
weapon the
not
right
sure
way.
that's true.
No, I'm pretty
If
sure. I'm pretty sure that's true. Because
10% of the population can't learn to tie their shoes, I don't know.
no,
Part of me thinks that's
in
false.
the military
That's also,
in the
hold
mil
on. That's also with the assumption that IQ is meaningful, like in a serious way. Whereas I'm pretty sure we've determined by now that there are multiple measurements of intelligence that we could use.
That's true. No, no, you're correct, 100% correct. But in the military manner, to fold your laces left over right and to have your uniform correct every day, a person of the level of IQ will fuck that up all the time. I served with very, very stupid people myself, and I've noticed people that couldn't even do something like get their buttons on right. They couldn't even fold their sleeves the right way. They couldn't get the like everything was a challenge to them because they couldn't sort it out in their mind. And these are people who passed the threshold to be in the military. These aren't people who were rejected. These are people who are in the military. People I personally served alongside, and they were just mess ups. They just could not get anything straight. No matter how much you train them, no matter how much you teach them, it's incredibly hard to get these people to do the exact cookie cutter regimen of things to do. Now, I'm not saying a person who has Down syndrome. I'm not putting that in the same category as these people, because these people have a functionality to them in society. They have some functionality. Their functionality is they might be able to work a job at 7-Eleven. They might be able to hold down a job in a mechanic shop changing oil. They might be able to do a cashier job. But that might be the limit of their capabilities. So when you reach the limit of a full range of millions of people whose capability isn't much more than pressing a button, what do you do with this large swath of people? You have to then try to figure out your best way to employ them. But then again, putting a massive vote power in these people's hands for their individual companies won't necessarily guarantee that those companies would be steered in the best direction. I don't know of any instances that I can recall where a vote where something like that was always in the best interest of the company. Now, I've seen a lot of issues with capitalism. I'm not going to by any means sidestep the problems with crony capitalism, phony capitalism, with money injections, money in politics. These are things that need to go away. I would get on
Okay.
board with anybody that's doing their best to get rid of those types of dirty mechanisms that gum up our system. However, I'm also in favor of adopting certain socialist policies that help our economy and our society. I believe things like unemployment and welfare are mechanisms that need to stay in place no matter what, because people lose their job, and then
Time.
people get unemployment. People lose a lot of people lose a lot under a lot of larger circumstances that are beyond them. Look at what we got COVID-19 right now. People who work as waitresses and waiters are not bringing in the money that they were bringing in before at all because their dining rooms are closed. Now, that's not
Sure.
to say now a diner who has to shut down in a time like this, their workers they can't vote to keep the place open. They can't do anything.
Well, I think there are numerous systems that we could employ, anyway, just to make sure that if something like a pandemic happened, we could make sure that, you know, mutual aid, comrade. We can all just come out and help the old lads that are out of work. I want to mention, I now you're against crony capitalism, which I think is good, obviously. You know, get get that shit out of our politics. But I just a part of the wealth inequality as it stands, I think that's sort of something that's more inherent in the system than what you would like to believe. Because if we just want to look at like super PACs and everything, I mean, Jesus, think about not too long ago, just a big billionaire man came in and was able to make significant waves in the Democratic primaries.
We're talking about Bloomberg.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, here's the problem with if we're gonna switch gears right quick and we take a look at our politics on the main stage. It's a joke right now. It's a joke. And the problem we were left with in 2016 is Donald Trump certainly was the lesser of two evils. Donald Trump was a better candidate because of who the Democratic Party had put forth. Now, Bernie was robbed of the nominee the first time around,
sure.
and he was
Yeah,
robbed of it again this past couple days ago.
yeah.
Here's the thing, that they want Bernie, the big time they want Bernie, right? But
Dude,
Bernie cannot possibly deliver what has already been delivered to our country. So a moment ago I was talking about unemployment. 10% of our country has an IQ around 83 or below, right? We just pre-corona we were at 3.6 unemployment. Now there's a free market solution to a serious problem. So between 6 and 7% of Americans, which is about 22% of Americans, that are literally unemployable people who can barely perform jobs, who can't make it to work on time, very people who find it very difficult to do something as rudimentary as put an envelope in an envelope, lick it and mail it out. These are people who have trouble with the finest of motor things. They have jobs now. They have employment. And I don't know if it being left into the hands of the work group, if they would make the same decisions that the free market would have made. Because when the free market is doing well, generally everybody else is doing well. A lot of people point to the fact that there are more billionaires in the world now than ever before. Well, I also like to point to the fact that there are more billionaires in the world now than ever before. This is something that essentially defeats itself by saying that there are more billionaires in the world now than ever before. Means that there's upward mobility for billionaires, which means there's upward mobility for millionaires, et cetera, et cetera. If you had a democratized workplace, I don't necessarily think that there's a way to move up in the ladder in the same way, because then you essentially would be spending your time campaigning for the next position as opposed to earning it by time and work.
Time.
Well, oh, shit, what?
Oh,
Okay.
Morton Christie
So,
he was calling 3 minutes time.
oh, I see. Okay. Um, so, uh, just to wrap up on the IQ thing, I guess, in my opinion, just really quick. Again, you know, those people just won't be uh voted on to be the ones to make the big decisions. I still think, as a part of sort of humane conditions, they should still be given some say. But fucking bees and like ants have figured out democracy, so I'm pretty sure we could do the same thing.
Are you gonna
um,
give me? Are we gonna do the lobster argument?
yeah, like bees do like the fucking little waggle dance. You know what I mean, right?
Yes,
Like
yes.
when
I
they
I
vote
know
on
I know what you're
where the
talking about.
hive goes. So I'm pretty sure we can figure out with our big old monkey brains something similar.
Right.
Anyway, um, I don't know. That's just me being hopeful. Um, you can disagree with that as much as you want. Now,
No, I wouldn't
sorry.
disagree. I wouldn't disagree with hope. This is the thing is I think personally, to move apart from this, I think your heart's in the right place. What I think, just to wrap it up for me, is I think that you might have been misled a little bit with some of the flowery language of early Marxism, and now moving into the democratic socialist era of these things, because democratic socialism essentially is syndicalism. It's just a returned out idea. The Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. It was only established in 1917. These other systems have been going longer and stronger, and again, I didn't want to post blames of any historical atrocities to either your side or my side. Rather, I'd rather look at the larger percentage of people that were left out of it. To date, and as of 2017, America feeds about 350 million non-U.S. citizens pretty much every year. So that's not Americans. That's people outside of America. And just I think it was a year ago we gave 49 billion in aid, and we also let in more people than any other nation on the planet. It's close to a million each year. So and people keep sort of wrenching down on America that America isn't doing enough. America isn't doing enough. We are doing far more than many than any other nation.
Well,
I think relative to size. Um, but that's like
oh, no,
it,
no,
it,
not
it,
relative to size. We certainly give like the most in terms of total amount of aid, in the forms of food and stuff like that. And I guess mainly actually military aid. I guess that gets counted into actual foreign aid. So, um, yeah, so like military troops in Afghanistan, that gets counted as our foreign aid,
yeah,
quote unquote.
right.
So really, while it's true that we do give a lot of food, I'm not sure if that's like as true for per capita spending. I'm pretty sure that's just for the total dollar amount.
For 1% of our gross, yes, you're right. It's 1%. It's 1% of our gross.
Either way, in America, food and stuff like that, tons of it gets wasted. I think we
That's
could do
true.
a better job with distributing it fairly and equally.
That's true. That you know what there are problems, and some of it has to do with prior trade agreements. We're going to see a change in that. But you're 100% true. We waste a lot. We waste a lot in America, not just as people, but also the industries are forced to waste a lot because of the regulations. But I do believe in the regulation of industry over the democratizing of the workplace. Like the regulation of a free market has only provided. I mean, it did provide a lot of atrocities. I won't argue with that with you at all. I mean, we have towns that have been ravaged by companies like the Koch brothers, who had paper
Yeah.
mills and companies, and the chemicals seeping into the ground was setting the water on fire. This is bad. These people should be fined, and everyone should be compensated. But this is terrible. I don't advocate this at all whatsoever. But we have to look at the industrial properties of the United States, what we make in terms of textile, how much we feed the world, and how much global trade we are involved in. We create wealth for not just us, but for the largest portion of the world that exists outside of the Western civilization.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that wealth would still be there even if we, democratize the workplace because workers create wealth.
Uh,
Me, we go to work and we do our job and that makes money.
Correct.
It's not so much that the boss or whoever is doing it. I mean, we were talking about it earlier. He might earn 50 times more than you or I, but at the end of the day, he's not doing 50 times the work.
Yes.
Uh, you can say what you want about managing things and how much wealth that creates, which it certainly creates some level of wealth. Does it justify 50 times the wage of the average worker? Probably not. Um, I do want to say that we well, just in general, the aid that we give to foreign countries comes back to help us, and so if we try to give more as an overall percentage instead of like bombing countries or whatever, then that might come back to help us a little bit, I think, and also just serve to make the world like America more because, as it stands, everyone fucking hates the U.S.
Yeah,
Uh,
there is a large sentiment of that. I will agree. Um, but to quickly pivot to our final topic, which is going to be birth of capitalism. So
oh,
part of our discussion hinged on the birth of capitalism. I wanted to get your ideas on the birth of capitalism and Karl Marx's predictions on socialism, uh, just before the emergence of the Soviet Union.
okay. So capitalism in general, modern capitalism came about ultimately as an evolution from old mercantile capitalism,
Hmm.
um, and all the atrocities and slavery and everything that came from that,
Hmm.
up until about geez, mercantile capitalist structures have been in place until like the mid late 1800s with, like, for example, the East India Company, which
Mm-hmm.
was a private company chartered by the crown,
Mm-hmm.
to control basically all of India, and starvation, famine, everything happened there is crazy. You can also talk about, something like the Great Hunger in Ireland,
Uh-huh. Yes.
which,
Potato famine.
yeah, yeah, the potato famine, which killed a million people and forced like upwards of like 2 million people to emigrate. So in general, capitalism, while it was better than feudalism,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, and while modern capitalism, with all of our sort of transitions away from slavery and stuff like that happened under mercantile capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
while what we have now is better than then, I just feel like if we continue to crunch down those hierarchies, we had the hierarchy of the slave owner and the slave. We've now largely replaced that with the relationship between the employer and the employee. I feel that if we all just finally break down that last hierarchy with just one class of people, um, will be able to live better, because so far it seems like breaking down all of those hierarchies and all of those class distinctions has so far been positive. If we want to talk about the feudal lord and his serf, or even before that, the patrician Roman dude and his slaves, and
Mm-hmm.
before that, the Bronze Age pharaohs and all sorts of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is interesting to me that we live in a period where, while we've managed to break down all of those hierarchies, even still, we do have something that, in terms of wealth inequality, because it's gone unchecked, it's sort of the reactionary elements have come back to sort of enforce those almost older type hierarchies with people who have concentrated so much wealth that, I guess, Richard Wolff,
Right.
a noted socialist economist, has mentioned that it's something quite similar to the wealth equality of the pharaohs in Egypt. So I think that if we just continue to in place, restrictions on unjustly acquired wealth, and continue to break down all those hierarchies, we'll just live in a better world. That's my opinion.
Okay. It's good. It's definitely a strong statement. I will say this though, in terms of in contrast to it, for the birth of capitalism, beginning after the feudal era, which was 12th century around 15th century, is the birth of our modern capitalism as we know it, coming with the birth of industry. So the idea of paying a factory worker and that kind of thing. But my understanding and knowledge prior to that, and even prior to the mercantile capitalists, and going all the way back to let's say Rome. Rome itself was founded on 7 hills between modern Etruscany of the time and an archipelago of Greek colonies at what is southern Italy, and they founded
Sure.
as a trading post between these two people. Rome itself would have not existed, and Rome brought about new ideas that came to revolutionize the entire world. And one of those was that a slave was able to buy their freedom. They would negotiate with their masters for time and price, and essentially they would be able to. It was the first time. It was a revolutionary. It was as revolutionary as Rousseau. It was as revolutionary as the idea of having freedom of religion. It was the most revolutionary idea of all time, and in no time before that were you able to purchase your freedom. Now that went away in between that time. Serfs of the feudal era could not purchase their way out. They were there forever. They would live and die in
Yeah.
their station in life, just like prior to Rome, where people would, again, going back to the Egypt. When we look at the most unfair and the largest disparities of wealth in our nation, we look at our most liberal states. We take a look at California, which is essentially set up an ivory coast of the most rich and powerful, yet they still have the largest portion of homeless people. They have rows upon
Yeah.
rows of people who live, and this is mostly due to those policies, due to the policies of sanctuary state, due to the policies of the liberal side. I'm not sure that I can point to any kind of indication that a social democracy would uplift that situation. I think that from watching all the businesses leave California and become more prosperous in other states because of less regulation and less absurd laws and rules that keep them in a position of power and take less from everyone else, this is not necessarily something that the free market economy was doing. I'm not saying it hasn't ever done it before, because it certainly has, and that's why we need the heaviest regulation we can have on those types of industries without driving those industries away from America, because those industries are what are the lifeblood of our country. How things are made, how things are produced, education, innovation, all these things are the lifeblood of what keeps America running. And I think that with these systems, that with the right regulation, that we're probably on the best track because we have the best record so far. Um, we have the best record in terms of lifting people from poverty, and the idea that any family could rise and fall in America is not something that's prevalent around the world. Not many families rise and fall in other countries in the same rate that they do here in America. So, for based on this and the idea of the idea of property rights and owning your own property, I would still say that I would have to lean in the affirm of capitalism.
Okay. To your point that these Western sort of states, like for example, you might know me, Caskie,
Mhm.
uh, being a reference to like the Pacific Northwest. So I'm from the Seattle area. Um, there's there are numerous numbers of reasons for why Western states tend to be wealthier compared to anywhere in between the West Coast and the East Coast. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
they're just the numerous historic and geographic regions or reasons, sorry, for why people came to these areas. But to your point that um, that liberal politics, despite all of these things, uh, I guess people are fleeing with their companies. Um, that's again, like yeah, they're going elsewhere to where they can have less regulation to make more money for one person.
Uh-huh.
Whereas ultimately, if we just all worked collectively, I guess in our little worker co-ops, we'd probably do a pretty good job of making money for everyone, and no one would have to worry about anything. Um, to all of these homeless people that have to suffer, for example in Seattle, Seattle has a massive homelessness problem right now.
Uh-huh.
So
I
I
think it's around 13,000 right now.
yeah, it's pretty high, it's up there. Um while while I guess well, we have a socialist mayor, but she can't do everything. um while we can have liberal politicians in government that performatively do little things, like for example Biden. Do you think Biden's going to do anything? Like absolutely not. He's
I
not.
think Biden is like a puppeteer, a corpse puppeteered
Yeah, yeah,
by the establishment.
yeah,
Because I mean, we
exactly.
look at him; he's like he's got the formaldehyde already in him. I was
Yeah,
listening to
yeah,
Joey
he's
Diaz the other
already.
day. He's got the formaldehyde already in him. Look at him; he can't talk, he can't form sentences, and
Yeah,
everybody's jumping ship to remain with Biden because Biden was there for the credit card companies. He was their
yeah,
guy, so that's why they want him back in power.
yeah. Biden is pretty much falling apart at the seams. So I think, like, I agree with you that these people in the Democratic establishment that aren't, that are in charge of places like, in California, what have you, while they can, look good doing little performative actions, barely addressing any systematic issues in these places, um, it's real leftists, like, you know, people like me, I guess, now, that are still hoping to address actual systematic issues with our economy and try to improve conditions for people.
All right, excellent. It has been 1 hour, and
Oh,
it has been an excellent talk. I'm going to do my outro right quick.
all right.
I appreciate you coming on and having a civil discussion and
Yeah.
having this opportunity. And I'm hoping if you're up for it, we'll call it right now. We'll do a part two in let's say a week.
Okay, sure.
We can do one. We can do one
Yeah,
on. We can do one on the on. Essentially, we'll remain on the political side of the house because if I feel like our conversation was leaning towards presidency and the election, so we could definitely do a part two on that and then circle it up with socialism over capitalism, capitalism over socialism, in a second debate if you're willing to.
Sure. Yeah, no, it was nice talking to you. I was talking to that person that was in the Discord earlier that had debated you, I guess, on like a movie or something. And I was pretty sure that was going to be I don't know, more of like an aggressive bad faith
Oh,
talk. But no,
so
I
you
enjoyed
thought
talking to you.
you thought I was coming with bad faith?
No, no, not well at first, just because that dude was pretty angry, I think, with you.
Oh,
But no, talking to you
Was it
was pretty.
Starlust? Was that the guy, Starlust?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh
Yeah,
no. Oh man. All right. So that was a pretty crazy one. All right. So let's wrap this up and then I'll talk about that
yeah.
before I let you go. All right. So this has been You 2 One Day and Caskie. You can see Caskie at you can go ahead and give him your YouTube. We can see it here in the
Yeah.
link. Caskie on YouTube, a new lefty boy doing what I can do, right my past wrongs, just let's see, just getting started and seeing what I can do with what I have. Expect content to include discussions. Okay, that's awesome. We will go ahead and promote that link to our people, as
Hey,
well
thank
as a
you.
link to our channel, and we'll pull this around again in, let's say, a week.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just to close myself, yeah, so it's been me, Kasky. I love everyone, I guess. There are some points that I wanted to get to also that we were just talking about in our comments. But we can get to that next time. Just things like global warming, student debt, stuff like that. So yeah, we can get to that next time.
Excellent. Sounds awesome.
I'm only doing it 'cause this lifestyle's all I see.
When the pockets get thicker, fit a little slicker. What you gonna do? When the girls hit your line, want a little more than time. What you gonna do? When everybody tryna cash and your ex won't back in. What you gonna do? What you gonna do?
Like, share, and subscribe for more.